The fog in Coldwater wasn't the kind that simply rolled in and lifted with the sun. It clung to every shingled roof, slid down empty streets like a restless soul, whispering a secret no one was ready to tell. This morning, it wrapped itself around Nathan Cole, a former soldier with a cold scar running across his left hand, just before the rusted steel bridge. Blocking his way stood Lila Hart, 7 years old, sneakers worn to the threads, one toe peeling upward. Her small hands gripped the hem of her shirt tight. "Mister, my mom's not here anymore," she said, voice low, each word sharp as a knife honed in the dark. Nathan looked into her eyes, and what he saw wasn't the innocence of a child, but an unsettling emptiness. Right then, he understood. His road home had ended, and another one, far more dangerous, had just begun. A late autumn morning, the town still wrapped in a thin veil of mist. The sun hadn't climbed high enough to dry the beads of dew clinging to tin roofs and window bars. Main Street was empty, save for the faint hiss of wind threading through bare elm branches and the scent of fresh pastry drifting from the little shop on the corner. Nathan Cole moved slowly along the worn brick sidewalk, a paper coffee bag warm in his hand. The heat seeped through the thin paper into his calloused palm, traveled up his wrist, and settled in his chest like a deep breath. He wasn't in a hurry. On mornings like this, he always walked from his cabin on the hillside into town, not just for coffee, but to watch the place wake slowly, the way he'd learned to survive after the war. At the corner where the main road turned into a smaller lane leading uphill, the silver light of morning spilled across the cracks in the pavement. There, a small figure stood almost motionless. The gray sweater hung too loose on her, sleeves falling past her wrists, and her sneakers were worn to the point the toes curled upward. Her small hands gripped the hem of her sweater as if holding herself in place against the cold wind. Nathan slowed. He didn't recognize the face, but something in the way she stood, tilted slightly to one side, as if searching for balance, felt familiar. He'd seen it before, maybe at a bus station or on the edge of a temporary camp where soldiers had just evacuated civilians from a blast zone. An old instinct stirred, the kind that had saved him and his men more than once. When he was only a few steps away, the girl looked up. Her gaze didn't plead or beg for sympathy. It measured him quietly, quickly before deciding something. Her left hand released the sweater hem, hovered uncertainly, then suddenly caught the edge of his olive coat sleeve. The touch was so light he might have missed it if he hadn't stopped. Her lips moved, and 7 words broke apart like dew on grass. "Sir, my mom can't breathe anymore." The sound was so thin the wind could have carried it away, yet it cut through the muted stillness of the morning, triggering something primal. No crying, no dramatics, just a shallow breath, stretched thin as a fraying thread. Nathan felt his heartbeat stall, then quicken, as though a switch had been thrown. The faint contentment of a peaceful morning, something he rarely allowed himself, was suddenly tangled with an urgent pull. The feeling of being needed, right here, right now, came rushing back. He didn't know who she was or what waited behind her words, but he knew one thing with absolute clarity. If he walked on, those 7 words would stay with him forever, like the faces he hadn't reached in time. The paper bag whispered against his palm as he tightened his grip. The heat was no longer for warmth, but to keep his hand from shaking. He lowered the coffee to the curb, his eyes locked on hers. In that brief span, all the other sounds of the small street, the shop door chime, the distant footsteps, the wind, fell away. Only a shaped silence remained, compressed between them. He gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, but it was absolute agreement. Somewhere inside, a door opened. The quiet joy he'd found in this town now had a new shape. It was tied to protecting what had just appeared before him, and he understood it could only survive if he stood between it and whatever was making it tremble. No one hurried him, yet each step forward felt steadier, as if the ground had changed underfoot. He had heard too many pleas for help in his life, but rarely had they come in such a quiet form. And it was that quiet, together with the small hand gripping him, that told him he would not allow himself to step back from this moment on. Above them, the late morning light began to reach down, catching the brown strands of her hair and lifting them into the cold air. Nathan had no idea where the road ahead would lead, only that he had stepped into a new kind of battle. Not with bullets, but with forces unseen, strong enough to steal the breath from someone's lungs. And this time, he wouldn't let anyone face it alone. The morning air was still thick with cold when Nathan crouched down to meet the girl's eyes. There was nothing in her face that signaled panic, yet there was a deep urgency there, as if every second slipping past was pulling her small world further out of reach. Wide eyes, clear yet weary, didn't blink as they locked on him. The gaze of someone who'd already learned that shouting didn't always bring help. So she chose one person only and sent her final signal his way. He didn't ask much, didn't try to soothe her with hollow words, only tilted his head slightly so he could hear when her lips moved. There was no wind to drown them out, yet he still felt the fragile space between her words and her quickened breath like a thread drawn to its limit. He heard those 7 words again, not louder, but heavier now that he was ready to let them settle in his memory. Her small fingers still held the cuff of his coat sleeve, the damp warmth of her palm seeping into the thick fabric, grounding him in something solid, human. A current ran down his spine, not fear, but the sharp activation of a protective instinct. Fragments of the past flickered through his mind. Another small hand like this one clutching at him on the tarmac of a military airfield the day he came home, his daughter's hand, gone forever only months later. He drew in a slow breath, the scent of coffee from the paper bag on the curb mixing with the damp, metallic smell of morning. That scent pulled him firmly back into the present. He knew he had to choose right now, and it wasn't a choice between right and wrong, or risk and safety. It was a choice about whether he could live with himself if he walked away. The answer came instantly, bypassing reason. He couldn't. "Where's your house?" The question slipped out like reflex. She didn't answer in words, just turned, tucking her hands into her sweater sleeves, and ran toward the narrow street that led to the edge of town. He followed, first in long strides, then lengthening them into a steady pace to keep her in sight. The street gave way to a dirt road flanked by low, weathered fences. The sound of her sneakers striking the ground mixed with the crunch of gravel beneath his boots. No words passed between them, only the shifting distance, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, but never breaking entirely. Now, and then she glanced back, not to check if he was still following, but as if gauging just how far to keep him within her sightline. The wind off the hillside stirred the roadside trees, sending a few yellow leaves drifting into her hair. He noticed her stride wasn't ragged. It was steady, as though she'd made this trip many times alone. The thought carried both admiration and an ache. A child shouldn't be so familiar with seeking help this way. Past the last row of houses, the road widened and patched asphalt took over. Nathan recognized the outskirts, scattered wooden houses on low, uneven ground, front yards choked with weeds. She turned up a small incline, her steps slowing. He understood. It wasn't fatigue, it was because what lay ahead was the place those 7 words had pointed to. From the crest of the hill, he could see the slanted roof, a thin coil of smoke rising from the chimney, but hanging low, too weak to climb. She paused for a moment before heading to the door, her small shoulders shivering in the morning wind. Nathan closed the distance, feeling the invisible tension waiting at the other end. The sound of birds and wind had fallen away. Only his heartbeat remained, steady and sure, matching her pace. In that moment, he knew he'd stepped out of the life where he answered only for himself and back into the territory of commitments. The fragile joy of that morning had taken on a new shape, a silent promise that from this point forward, nothing and no one would touch this girl without his say. And when her hand let go of his sleeve at the doorstep, reaching for the worn wooden handle, he was ready to follow, not out of curiosity, but with a clear resolve. Joy could only survive if it was protected, and he would be the one to do it, even if it meant standing against the whole world outside. The wooden steps gave a muted groan under Nathan's boots as he followed close behind Lila. The front door of the house was ajar, its rusted hinges leaving a narrow gap wide enough for the cold to slip through. The girl didn't look back at him. She simply lifted her small hand and pushed it open wider. The hinges let out a thin rasp, carrying with it a smell, part acrid smoke, part stale dampness, that told him this place hadn't been cared for in a long time. Dim light spilled in from outside, casting long stripes across the floor, revealing motes of dust suspended in the air. In the corner of the kitchen, the toaster was still plugged in, its narrow slot breathing out the scorched scent of forgotten bread. The small table by the window was littered with unwashed dishes, crumbs, and a dry coffee stain. On the chair beside it, a pastel birthday card lay tipped over, the childish scrawl reading "Happy Birthday, Mom," crayon colors bleeding toward the edge of the paper. Nathan stepped further in, his eyes sweeping the space with the ingrained precision of a soldier. Every detail spoke at once. No trace of anyone here besides a mother and daughter, yet the state of the place signaled exhaustion, depletion. No kettle whistling, no footsteps, just the dense, heavy quiet that reminded him of abandoned houses in war zones, where life had retreated but faint warmth still clung to the air. In the middle of the wooden floor, Marianne Hart lay curled on her side. Her long black hair spilled loose and tangled against a pale cheek. One arm was draped over a chair leg, her hand half open as if something had just slipped from it. Her breathing was so shallow Nathan had to pause to catch the slight rise and fall of her chest. Light slanted through the window, outlining faint bluish shadows under her eyes. Lila stopped at the kitchen doorway, clutching her stuffed bear tight to her chest, her gaze fixed on her mother. She didn't rush forward or cry out, just stood there, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile scene before her. Nathan felt the weight of that stillness, the kind children learn after witnessing collapse too many times. He knelt, one hand braced against the floor for balance, the other touching lightly at Marianne's neck. Her skin was colder than he expected. Her pulse was weak and erratic. He pressed his palm to her sternum, feeling the interrupted rhythm of her breath. No alcohol, no medicine on her, only the faint metallic tang of the kitchen and burnt toast. The emergency steps his body knew by reflex surfaced in his mind. Lila hadn't moved, only squeezed her bear tighter, her head dipping slightly, but her eyes never leaving her mother. Nathan looked up, his gaze passing through the space between them before he spoke. His voice low, steady, not hurried but wasting no time. He didn't ask her anything. This wasn't the moment for questions. It was the moment to act. Sliding one arm under Marianne's neck and the other around her back, he lifted her. She was nearly weightless. The worn gray sweater on her shoulders slipped down, revealing the sharp ridge of her collarbone. The scent of cheap soap clung faintly beneath the burnt smoke smell of the toaster, a mix that lodged itself in his mind. Crossing the kitchen, he felt the floor dip slightly in spots, the boards creaking under each step. Lila trailed close behind, her bare footsteps silent, only the faint rustle of the bear's stuffing marking her presence. He angled his shoulder through the narrow doorway and headed for the front of the house. Cold air rushed in as soon as they stepped outside, cutting through the fading warmth from the body in his arms. On the porch, the lights sharpened, making him squint for a heartbeat. The girl moved ahead, pushing open the door of an old pickup still marked with dust from last week's drive through the woods. Nathan eased Marianne into the passenger seat, tilting her head back slightly to keep her airway open. He pulled a spare coat from behind the seat and spread it over her. In that brief moment, he glanced at Lila through the side window. She stood close to the rear door, bare in her arms, eyes locked on every movement he made, unblinking. There was something in that look, part guarded, part hopeful, that tightened the invisible thread binding him to them both. He opened the rear door and gestured for her to climb in. She sat straight-backed, bare on her lap, eyes forward, as if bracing for a journey she had made before, but one that was different this time, because he was there. Nathan shut the door, circled to the driver's side, got in, and turned the key. The engine coughed to life, its low growl vibrating through the wheel. Before shifting into gear, he glanced at Marianne again. Her breathing was still uneven, but each inhale seemed a fraction deeper. One hand on her lap twitched faintly. Nathan set his grip on the steering wheel, the cold leather pressing into his palm, and locked the decision in his chest. Not a second more would be lost. The tires rolled off the porch's packed earth and onto the slope leading away. In the rearview mirror, he saw Lila sitting upright, her gaze fixed on her mother beside him. The bear's frayed ear bobbed with each bump, but her arms never loosened. And in that silence, Nathan heard more clearly than any words. This wasn't just a drive. He was carrying a fragment of trust that had been placed directly into his hands. Nathan's hand stayed firm on the wheel, but his gaze kept flicking to Marianne, as if afraid that if she left his sight for even a moment, that fragile breath might fade away. She sat slumped to one side, propped by the coat he had wrapped around her shoulders, head tilted back just enough to keep her airway open the way he'd been trained. Her face was pale, lips drained of all color, as if they'd just let go of the last trace of blood. Outside, the rain thickened, each drop striking the windshield and streaming into long trails the wipers swept away in steady, urgent arcs. The sound mingled with the worn rumble of the old truck's engine, a rhythm steady enough to be reassuring, yet strung tight with tension. Nathan pressed the accelerator a little harder, the tires skidding briefly over a layer of wet leaves before finding grip again. He knew every bend, every pothole on this road, but today each meter stretched longer than it should. Lila sat silently in the back, clutching her stuffed bear, eyes locked on her mother. Not a word passed between them, but Nathan could feel the weight of that silence. It wasn't the emptiness of indifference. It was the stillness of a child who'd learned that staying quiet was the only way to keep fragile things from breaking. In the mirror, he caught her gaze fixed on her mother's limp hand resting on her lap, as though watching for the smallest movement. The truck jolted hard over a gravel stretch. Nathan reached across to steady Marianne, keeping her head from lolling. His fingers brushed the cold, faintly rough skin of her wrist, a sensation that pulled him back to years earlier, carrying his wife on a similar ride. Except that time, he'd been too late. Not this time, he told himself. Not again. He shifted gears smoothly, pressing deeper on the gas. Each time the tires plowed through a puddle, the muffled roar beneath the chassis felt like a push forward. Beyond the glass, rows of trees blurred past, their leaves whipping in the rain. Nathan leaned slightly, pulling a small cloth from the glove compartment to wipe the fog from the passenger window, needing to see her face clearly. She was still breathing thin, fragile breaths, but they were there. Behind him, Lila shifted, setting the bear aside and wrapping her arms around her knees. Her gaze drifted to the side window, where raindrops slid down in winding paths. Nathan caught, in the mirror, the small hand she pressed to the glass, tracing a shaky line before pulling it back. He said nothing, but the image stayed with him, a reminder that a quiet world was unfolding behind him, parallel to his race against time in the driver's seat. Time felt both stretched and compressed. Every turn of the wheels brought them closer to the hospital, yet each turn also piled the weight heavier on his shoulders. In the cramped cab, the cold seeping from the windows mixed with the faint warmth radiating from Marianne's body, filling the space with a taut, unspoken urgency. Nathan kept his eyes on the road, but in his mind, the mission was already drawn in sharp lines. Get Marianne to safety, keep Lila close to her mother, and let no one wedge themselves between them now. A bend in the road opened up to a wider view, the distant glint of the hospital's silver roof. Nathan's grip on the wheel tightened, foot pressing the accelerator again. The truck responded in a way that felt almost like his own heartbeat. In the passenger seat, Marianne stirred, a faint sound escaping her throat. Lila immediately leaned forward, eyes wide. Nathan glanced at her and caught the look, fear intertwined with hope. And he knew this wasn't just a drive to the ER. This was a promise taking shape, a lifeline he had no intention of letting go. He eased off the gas as the truck rolled onto the concrete drive, leading straight to the emergency bay. The drum of rain softened under the broad awning. Sliding the gear into park, he killed the engine. In the sudden hush, Marianne's breathing was the only sound, thin but undeniably alive. Nathan knew the hardest part of the day was still ahead, but at least for now, they had made it through the longest stretch. Before reaching for the door latch, Nathan let the moment stretch, letting the rain outside recount the road they'd just traveled. Time thinned, stretched taut like a yellowing strip of film, every frame of the drive laid out in sharp relief. The patchwork of light and shadow on the road, the spatters of mud flung up against the wheel well, the relentless sweep of the wipers cleaving through water, the smell of damp resin inside the cab, mingling with the cold of early mist. When the truck had first pulled away from a house, he'd heard the crunch of gravel under the tires like a departure ritual. To his right, Marianne's head had tilted into the fold of his coat, her broken breaths fogging the glass. He'd set 2 fingers to the angle of her jaw to check her breathing, then returned his hand to the wheel. A small gesture repeated again and again, the way one might touch a talisman. In the back seat, Lila sat straight, hands wrapped around her stuffed bear. In the mirror, Nathan had caught her gaze, dry, unbroken, yet wide in a way that belonged to someone older than her years. At times, her small hand would reach up to trace a thin line through the condensation on the rear window, the mark wavering and vanishing as the truck jolted over a pothole. She said nothing. Her silence pressed on his chest like a stone, urging his foot down on the accelerator while keeping his grip steady on the wheel. The rain thickened, then thinned again. In the stretch of road that cut through the pines, The trees had leaned over, their canopies tossing back the sound of the engine in a deep, pulsing echo. Nathan's wrist turned the shifter, his foot found the bite of the tires. He knew the engine's lag, knew when to ease off to absorb a jolt, when to press hard to climb. It all happened in the tense quiet, and inside those automatic muscle-learned motions, something else rose up in him. A thin, unfamiliar thread of joy. Not noisy elation, but the steady sense of doing exactly what he was meant to do. The sense of a man still useful, still able to set his body between a breath and the darkness pressing against it. From the deepest part of memory, another road surfaced. Same wet air, same scent of rotting leaves. That night, he'd driven under headlights flashing off roadside reflectors, then dying in the dark behind him. No one had breathed in the seat beside him. Only the thin blanket he'd draped over what he refused to accept. He'd reached the hospital when the emergency ward had dimmed its lights, and they'd led him down a long corridor, pressing a paper and pen into his hands. The pen had weighed twice its size. Since that day, he'd taught himself to avoid highway lights at night, to drive slower, to hold his breath through the curves of memory. But this morning, with rain drumming the glass, the memory didn't bind him as it used to. It stepped back, a dark backdrop against which something else stood out. The small curve of Lila's back in the mirror. Her arms wrapped around a bear worn to the thread at the ear. Marianne's thin breaths drawing time back into the present. Joy revealed itself, so plain it was almost absurd, in hearing another breath alongside his own. And that joy instantly sparked the urge to guard it, like wind striking flame. The descent into the valley was slick as oiled glass. Nathan held the truck in the center lane, letting the front tires bite into the last gritty strip of traction. A passing lorry sent a crosswind, water fanning over them in a blinding white curtain. The wipers cleared it in a heartbeat, revealing low cloud and the faint glint of corrugated roofs ahead. He leaned over to straighten Marianne's seatbelt, folding his spare coat as a pillow behind her neck. Her fingers twitched. The movement was so small it cut sharp through him, not with panic, but with a tightening resolve. The last hill before town ended in a hairpin. He took it under speed, bracing his left knee into the seat frame the way he'd learned driving armored carriers over rubble. Everything in him kept time to the same order, on schedule, on rhythm, not a fraction off. In the back seat, Lila rested her forehead on the seatbelt, eyes fixed on her mother's wrist. She'd set the bear down, angled toward the front, as if it too were keeping watch. When the hospital's wide awning came into view, he didn't feel relief, but a loosening in his frame, the kind an athlete feels at spotting the finish line but still having strides to run. He kept his foot steady. Only when the tires touched the concrete under the shelter, the rain cutting off as if switched away, did he let out a long breath. The engine fell to a low, steady growl. In the stillness that followed, he could hear Marianne's breathing, the lift and fall beneath the coat. He touched the hollow of her shoulder lightly, then withdrew his hand quickly, wary of disturbing a fragile balance. Behind him, Lila rose out of her belt, placing both palms on the back of the front seat, but stopped there. Even in the cold, he saw the thin sheen of sweat at her temple. The quiet between them, oddly, steadied him. It was the kind of focus before an operation where everyone knew their part without needing a call. In that silence, the real battle line locked in. Not only against the crisis closing around Marianne's lungs, but against whatever waited beyond the automatic doors. Forms, stamps, cold phrasing, measuring eyes. He didn't shape the thought into words, but his body knew. If the morning's fragile joy had any chance, he would have to stand between it and everything that might strip it away. He glanced in the mirror one last time. Lila met his eyes without flinching. In that brief lock, something passed between them. She set her trust in his hands, and he took it the way a soldier takes a field kit before going out. No ceremony, no oath, just the smallest movement. Nathan's slow, firm nod, as if marking a line on an invisible plan. Beyond the glass, rain still streamed off the awning's edge. A nurse was pushing a gurney from the door. The emergency lights stepped up a notch, catching the wheel rim, flashing in his lenses. Nathan's hand found the latch. His fingers were sure, without hesitation. He knew once the door opened, everything would move at its own speed. But even inside that churn, he'd have his anchor, the joy of seeing two people still breathing, the need to keep those breaths steady through the rest of the morning, the resolve to hold a place no one had assigned him, but no one else could fill. The latch clicked, sharp as a beat. He opened the door, cold air cutting into his chest. His boots struck the wet concrete as he rounded the hood to the passenger side. Every move after that was clean, without waste. Unbuckle, support the neck, steady the shoulder, slip an arm, lift. Inside the cab, Lila didn't cry or stir, only drew her bear tighter against her. And in the gap between that moment and his first step away from the truck, Nathan knew exactly where he'd chosen to stand. A place he would not back away from, no matter how hard the rain fell or how fast the footsteps rushed the corridor. The urgent drive had brought them here, but inside him, another journey had just begun. In that one, joy was no longer the fragile thing of a morning that smelled of warm coffee. It was something tangible, a chest rising and falling, a child's dry eyes held steady by practiced silence, a soldier's hand braced between life and what would take it. And whatever waited beyond the glass doors, he knew he could endure, as long as they went through it together. The automatic glass doors of the emergency unit slid open with a dry beep, revealing a white bright corridor and the antiseptic tang of disinfectant mingled with the cold breath of the air conditioning. Nathan strode straight in, arms still holding Marianne in the safest position. She was so light that he found himself adjusting his own breathing, afraid a shift his chest might jar the body, softening against him by degrees. A nurse came toward him, moving quickly but without haste. They exchanged only glances and a few clipped words. Nathan set Marianne gently onto the gurney, careful to keep his coat draped over her. The wheels swiveled, then rolled away, the steady hum fading into the building's interior. For a brief moment, he caught the rise and fall of her shoulder under the fabric. Then she was gone beyond the gray-framed door. Behind him, Lila stood rooted at the edge of the tiled floor. Her hair was damp from the rain, a few strands plastered to her cheeks. The stuffed bear was clutched tight to her chest, almost hiding the collar of her sweater. When Nathan turned, she looked up at him, her gaze part wary, part waiting for something to be confirmed. He stepped closer, bending until their eyes were level. It was then her voice came, quiet, steady enough to cut through the background noise in the lobby. "They won't yell at my mom, right?" It wasn't the question of a child afraid of scolding over some mischief, but of someone who had seen something happen too many times to doubt it would happen again, unless someone stepped in to stop it. Nathan didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch for a few beats to be sure his reply wouldn't be an empty promise. A chill draft from the closing doors brushed his neck. He lowered himself just a little more and said, slow and firm, "No one will." She held his gaze for another moment before giving the smallest nod. The gesture reminded him of signal acknowledgments between soldiers, a nod that meant the order was understood and trusted, nothing more needed. The trust here was far more fragile than in any operation he'd been part of, but its weight was just as heavy, maybe heavier. The nurse guided them to the waiting area, where a row of cold metal chairs lined the wall. Nathan sat, Lila beside him, her feet not reaching the floor, the toes of her shoes swinging slightly out of habit. On the low table in front of them, old magazines and healthcare leaflets lay scattered. The fluorescent lights overhead did nothing to warm the sterile, colorless feel of the place. People moved back and forth in the corridor, but their section seemed cut off from that flow. Nathan said nothing, only reached behind his chair, pulled a water bottle from his bag, and handed it to Lila. She took it with both hands, sipping in small swallows. Each time her throat moved, her eyes stayed fixed on the door Marianne had passed through. In those minutes, he felt the pull inside him, memory on one side, this new responsibility on the other. 12 years earlier, he had stood in a different hallway, watching ER doors close, and no one had come out to say to him what he had just said to Lila. That absence now shaped the reason he meant to fill the space for her. Time in the waiting room moved differently than on the road. No clock ticked, yet he felt every minute stretch. Lila occasionally turned her bear, smoothing its ear, then hugged it again. Those small movements told him she was keeping herself calm. He kept his own silence, not breaking the stillness she was working to hold. When another nurse came out to ask for contact, Nathan rose and gave Marianne's name and what few details he knew. His voice was low, steady, betraying none of his urgency. He wanted everyone here to understand the woman wasn't an anonymous case. She had someone waiting, someone ready to speak for her when she couldn't. Returning to his seat, he saw Lila hadn't moved, though her gaze seemed a little less taut. Maybe his earlier answer, simple as it was, had been enough to give her something to anchor to. Nathan leaned back against the chair, eyes on that door. He knew that from here on, getting Mary Ann to the hospital would prove to be the simplest layer. The rest would be harder. But at least the first promise had been kept, and that was the ground he would step from into whatever came next. In that moment, with footsteps echoing and the hallway light sharp and cold, Nathan understood something plain. Sometimes protecting someone isn't about laying out a plan or swearing a grand oath. It's about one certain, unshaken sentence they can keep in their head when every other voice gets too loud. And he was ready to be the one to repeat it as many times as it took. The cold metal of the chair pressed into his back, and Nathan sat still in the pale, white glow of the corridor, as if the fluorescent light had leached the color out of everything around them. Footsteps of hospital staff echoed, then dissolved behind closed doors, leaving behind a stillness that wasn't quite peace. Lila sat beside him, legs swinging lightly, the toes of her shoes brushing the bar beneath the seat. Her stuffed bear was pressed to her chest, its worn for almost the same shade as her sweater. Nathan let the silence stretch for a while before leaning slightly toward her, asking quietly, "Do you and your mom usually have breakfast together?" Lila didn't lift her head, but he saw her small shoulders shift. First a faint nod, then almost immediately a shake. The answer, if it could be called that, said more than any words could. Nathan didn't press her. He'd learned in war zones that silence often drew the truth out more clearly than direct questions. A few minutes later, Lila spoke, slow and low, as if telling something she didn't want overheard. "Mom used to make donuts with colored sugar on top, but lately she only eats plain bread. She sleeps a lot 'cause her chest hurts." Nathan listened without interrupting. Each short sentence stacked into a mental picture. A small kitchen, a modest breakfast, and a woman quietly battling her own exhaustion without letting her daughter see too much of it. A sudden chill swept in when the hospital doors opened for someone coming through. Lila hunched in, hugging the bear tighter. Nathan noticed her hands were slightly bluish, sign of mornings without proper heat. He asked as if casually, "You got a heater at home?" She hesitated, then said, "We did. The neighbors lent us one. But they moved away." The words dropped between them like a small pebble into water, ripples spreading wide. Nathan understood this wasn't just about the cold. Losing the heater meant losing one of the few fragile ties they had to others. A nurse passed by, clipboard in hand, glancing at them briefly with a flicker of scrutiny before hurrying on. Nathan felt the gap between those who belonged in these halls, those used to paperwork and procedure, and people like him and Lila, just names not tied to any system. Lila didn't speak again. Instead, she tapped the edge of the chair with her fingertip in slow, steady beats. Nathan recognized it, a way of staying calm, just like a comrade he'd once had who counted finger taps before stepping into dangerous ground. He leaned over, searching his coat pocket until he found a hard candy he kept on him. The silver wrapper caught the light overhead. Without a word, he offered it to her. She took it, studying it for a moment before unwrapping. The soft crinkle of paper breaking the quiet made the tension in the air loosen just a little. In that waiting time, Nathan saw something more clearly. Joy, whether it was a piece of candy or a small nod, was always fragile, and without someone to guard it, it vanished as quickly as hospital doors closed behind you. He had lost too much already, and now every move he made was guided by the urge not to let history repeat itself. He glanced at Lila and caught her gaze fixed on the emergency room door. It wasn't fear in her eyes, but the look of a small sentry, willing to stand watch until she saw what she was waiting for. In that moment, Nathan knew. If he wanted to keep that look from being extinguished, he'd have to stand outside every door for as long as it took, until it was safe again. Neither of them spoke after that. Only the squeak of rubber soles on the floor, the faint beeping of a monitor from somewhere down the hall, and the lingering scent of antiseptic filled the space. But in that silence, a resolution had formed, quiet but irreversible. The girl had drifted off in her seat, head tilted to one side, a tangle of hair spilling across her cheek. Nathan sat a short distance away, far enough that if she stirred, he wouldn't wake her. The white ceiling light washed down over them, highlighting the faint shadows beneath Lila's eyes, shadows no 7-year-old should have. Her stuffed bear slipped from her arms and dropped to the floor with a soft thud. Nathan leaned down to pick it up. The once plush fur had been worn thin by time and a child's hands. Along one side, the seam had split, the fabric strands twisted into a clumsy knot. His fingers brushed the edge of the tear and felt that there was more inside than just stuffing. He glanced at Lila. Her breathing was steady, chest rising and falling slowly. Turning the bear over, Nathan eased the opening wider and found a small piece of paper, folded into quarters. He drew it out with the same care he might use to unfold a field dispatch. The paper was crumpled, its corner faintly damp, but the penciled letters were still clear, crooked, uneven lines as if written in a hurry. If Mom can't wake up, call the soldier who listens. Nathan lingered over those last 4 words. He remembered that first morning with Lila, her small hand gripping his, her broken sentence in the empty street. It turned out she had given him a name before he'd even realized it himself. The soldier who listens. Not the soldier who saves lives, not the soldier who fights, but the one who listens. A slow thought seeped into him like water, finding the cracks in stone. The girl's joy, the trust it took to put his name on paper, was so fragile she'd hidden it in the belly of a torn stuffed bear. That joy could only survive if someone was willing to stand guard before the doors the world might close between her and her mother. He folded the paper again, leaving the creases exactly as her small fingers had made them, and slid it back into the opening. He pulled the stuffing over it, then carefully tucked the seam closed, not to repair the bear, but to keep its secret shelter untouched. From down the hall, the PA system called for a doctor, then fell silent. Nathan placed the bear back in Lila's arms, so gently she only hugged it tighter in her sleep, without waking. He studied her face and realized something had shifted, not in her, but in himself. He'd always thought protecting someone meant standing watch, acting with force, blocking whatever might cause harm. But here, with Lila, protection began with keeping a folded scrap of paper in the belly of the stuffed bear, away from eyes that shouldn't see it. It was a quiet battle line the Army had never taught him to hold. In that moment, Nathan knew he wouldn't leave this story as just a passerby. No matter how cold the system, no matter how many suited faces lined up with their logic, he carried a promise now, in the form of a child's handwriting on a wrinkled piece of paper. Outside, the first winter wind slipped through rows of bare trees, carrying off the last yellow leaves of the season. Inside, a man sat motionless, holding in his mind the image of a worn stuffed bear and the paper inside it, as if they were the only key to a safer tomorrow for a child. And from that moment on, the small joy he'd been given had become an unshakable vow to protect. Midday at the town hospital carried its own kind of silence. Never true quiet, but a hush made from the shuffle of shoes over tile, the faint tap of pen against clipboard, and the distant beeping of heart monitors behind closed doors. Nathan sat in a gray plastic chair along the ICU corridor. Beside him, Lila rested her head against the armrest, her stuffed bear pressed to her chest. He was starting to think he would remain there until Marianne woke when the shadow of a pair of low-heeled shoes stopped in front of him. Nathan looked up. A woman in a light brown suit, an ID badge hanging at her collar, stood with an expression that was neither warm nor cold, waiting for his attention. "Mr. Cole?" Her voice was even, free of small talk. Nathan gave a short nod. "I'm from the county's social services department. We received a report about a minor without a legal guardian currently in an emergency situation." Nathan's gaze flicked to Lila. She was still looking down, fingers worrying at a loose thread on her bear's leg. The woman went on. "By regulation, we need to transfer her to a temporary care facility. It's a safe placement, staff supervision. Once her mother recovers, we'll work on reunification." Words like "by regulation" and "temporary" rang in Nathan's mind like the slam of a steel door. He rose to his feet, voice low but resolute. "I'll stay with her. I'll take responsibility until her mother can care for her again." The woman's expression didn't change. "You are not a legal relative. Without authorization or a court order, you can't keep her. We can't make exceptions." Nathan didn't answer right away. Years in the service had taught him that arguing in the heat of emotion only ceded ground. He glanced down at Lila. Her eyes stayed lowered, but her arms tightened around the bear, as if she heard and understood every word. The woman crouched to Lila's level, offering a smile that felt procedural. "Sweetheart, we're going somewhere new. Your own bed, toys, and—" Lila shook her head faintly, saying nothing. The gesture was small, but Nathan felt the air between them tense. He stepped half a pace forward, enough to place himself between the girl and the woman, not close enough to be confrontational, but close enough to make the point clear. "She's not going anywhere," he said, voice low, not sharp, more like an order already decided. The woman straightened, silent for a moment. "If you want to contest this, you're entitled to contact an attorney. But by this afternoon, without proper paperwork, we are required to proceed." She turned and walked away, her low heels clicking toward the nurse's station. Nathan stayed standing, shoulders drawn tight, until the only sounds left were the hum of the air conditioning and Lila's breathing. Then he sat again, fingers brushing the back of the chair beside him, a silent reassurance without direct touch. In his mind, old losses bled into the present. Years ago, when his daughter lay in a hospital room, there had been people in suits too, speaking in phrases about procedures and proper documentation. He hadn't been able to hold onto anything then. This time, he would not let the same script play out. He pulled out his phone, scrolling quickly to a name he hadn't called in years, Evelyn Price. A low, steady female voice answered on the first ring. "I need you here. Now," Nathan said. 15 minutes, came the reply. He ended the call, slid the phone into his pocket, and leaned back, eyes fixed down the corridor where the woman had vanished. He knew time was running, and rules waited for no one. But he also knew he'd just crossed the line from bystander to someone ready to stand in the way. Lila lifted her gaze briefly, meeting his eyes for just a second before looking down again. But that second was enough for Nathan to see it, the fragile beginnings of trust taking root. And if he wanted it to grow, he'd have to weather the full force of the headwind called procedure. The midday corridor had taken on a pale amber cast, as if seen through frosted glass. The wall clock made no sound, yet Nathan could hear time pass in the squeak of rubber soles on tile. Lila leaned her head against the backrest, clutching her bare, eyes fixed on the door where the gurney had vanished. He kept still beside her, as if guarding a small flame against the wind. 15 minutes later, the revolving door at the far end swung open. Evelyn Price stepped through in a dark coat, still speckled with rain. She didn't hurry, but her stride said she'd already plotted her path. When she reached him, Evelyn gave Nathan a short nod, her glance sliding to Lila, a silent acknowledgement that here was a child holding herself still so the world wouldn't shift again. "Where?" Evelyn asked, low enough not to startle the girl. Nathan tipped his head toward the nurse's station. No further words were needed. Years in the field had taught him to read a person's rhythm before hearing their speech. Evelyn's was steady as an anchor. At the counter, the social worker from earlier stood with a thick file hugged to her chest. Overhead lights gleamed on the clear plastic cover, cold as a winter river. Evelyn introduced herself succinctly, then requested a quick meeting with a hospital representative. Her tone wasn't loud or soft, only precise enough to leave no room for misinterpretation. A small conference room near the ICU was opened, laminate table for plastic chairs, a water cooler beaded with condensation. Dr. Mallory Grant entered last, her white coat crisp, patient chart tucked under one arm. She looked at Nathan for a beat, as though recalling seeing him carry Marion down the hall that morning. Her nod was the first thing all day that required no signature to confirm what everyone already knew. Evelyn began. She laid out the facts. A child arriving in the ER with an unconscious mother, brought in by a veteran, the girl holding to that man as her only point of reference. Evelyn didn't use words like rescuer or hero, only point of reference. The phrase settled on the table, soft but weighty. The social worker recited procedure again. Temporary, safe, care facility. Words like pebbles dropped evenly to fill the surface. Evelyn placed her palm on the edge of the file, stopping the motion. "We're not asking for an exception," she said. "We're asking for an adjustment within the framework. Allow the child to remain in the waiting area adjacent to ICU, under supervision with Mr. Cole, the person she voluntarily stays near. Once her mother is stable, we'll address the rest." Dr. Mallory leafed through the chart, moved a few pages, then looked up. "In the past 2 hours, she hasn't cried or called out, but only eats if he's sitting beside her. When staff approach, she looks to him first. When I examined her, she held the bear tight, but released it if he nodded. She spoke as if listing vital signs. Temperature, pulse, blood pressure, and then adding a new metric, connection." Evelyn turned to Nathan. "Can you stay here continuously?" Nathan nodded without hesitation. He'd stayed awake through nights of distant shelling beyond a ridgeline. A bright hospital corridor was no trial. All he'd ever needed was a reason to remain, and now he had one. The social worker spoke of precedent and liability. Evelyn fielded each term as if catching a ball thrown hard. "Hospital oversight is a layer of safety. I'll sign on behalf of my client. If necessary, I'll file supplemental paperwork this afternoon." Her voice was level, without any tone of winning or losing, only the steady pressure of a wedge keeping a door from closing. Dr. Mallory studied the blank wall for a moment. If we separate the child now, the mother's breathing could worsen. If she wakes without her daughter in sight, we'll be managing another crisis. I don't recommend it. She signed a memorandum, her signature slanted and firm. Silence followed. In it, Nathan heard the HVAC exhale with metronome regularity. He thought of the slip of paper inside the bear's belly. The soldier who listens. If there was ever a moment to set that on the table, it was now. He didn't voice it, but straightened in his seat so anyone looking would understand. He'd be here, even if it meant staying through the night. At last, the social worker nodded, though without the slightest hint of concession at her mouth. I'll note this as a temporary arrangement under supervision. We'll revisit at day's end. She gathered her files and stood. The chair's scrape across the floor was soft as a scratch. The meeting dissolved. Dr. Mallory left first, pausing at the doorway. When she wakes, I'll let you know. Short words, but to Nathan they felt like another line securing the boat to its mooring. Evelyn packed her papers without rushing. She looked at him, then down the hall to where Lila sat curled, chin on her bear. Keep the rhythm, Evelyn said quietly. Don't let her wait alone. No instructions beyond what could be done now. They returned to the row of chairs. Nathan took his same seat. Lila edged closer, enough for their sleeves to brush. No one spoke, but he knew the fragile arrangement they'd just won was a tarp against the steady rain called procedure. It wouldn't last forever, but it would let them breathe until stronger posts could be set. Evelyn lingered a moment, watching Lila pick at a thread on the bear's leg, then turned to the nurse's station to finalize the supervisory paperwork. Each signature was a small nail into the temporary floor they were standing on. Nathan watched, grateful for the way she made those cold letters feel less so. Time resumed at the pace of the HVAC. A nurse brought out a small plastic tray, setting a cup of warm milk before Lila. The girl looked to Nathan. He nodded. She lifted the cup in both hands, sipping slowly. The faint vanilla scent was the familiar smell of hospitals, but here it meant something else, a normal act completed without interruption. Nathan kept his eyes on the ICU door, where light sometimes flared brighter. Evelyn returned, resting a hand briefly on the back of his chair, her way of saying I'm still here, before stepping away to make a low, quick phone call. Dr. Mallory passed, giving him a nod that was easy to miss, and vanished around the corner. The bright flare of need Nathan had felt that morning had settled into something else, a silent watch he'd appointed himself to keep. Protection now meant straight-back posture, an unblinking gaze on the door, a nod for a cup of milk, and readiness to sign anything that kept this child from being taken before her mother opened her eyes. Under the temporary shelter of those signatures, his resolve was set. If they came back this afternoon insisting on carrying out procedure, he would still be sitting here, with lawyer beside him, with a doctor's word, with anything that could be stacked into a wall. Not to challenge for the sake of it, but to keep one small thing, the gaze of a child fixed on that door, from being extinguished. At the far end of the hall, the light above the ICU door shifted in tone. Nathan didn't spring up. He simply tightened his grip on the chair's edge, like someone bracing to lift a familiar weight. Evelyn came back, setting her case down. Lila placed the empty cup on the tray, arms wrapping around her bear again. Everyone knew that behind that glass, a breath was testing its way back. And this time, if it found its way out, someone would be waiting to keep it from being carried off again. The indicator light above the ICU door was still on, but the hurried footsteps inside had slowed. Nathan caught the change, the movement less urgent now, the clipped orders still firm but no longer edged with alarm. Evelyn sat a few seats away, her case still open, pen poised over an unfinished form. Lila was silent, head tilted slightly, her ear angled toward the door as if listening for something only she could hear. The door opened, light spilling into the hall along with a stronger wash of antiseptic. Dr. Mallory stepped out, mask lowered to her chin, the strap still faintly marked into her forehead. She didn't smile, but her eyes had softened. She's awake, she said quietly to Nathan. Weak, but awake. Blood pressure still low, needs oxygen. I think the daughter should go in. Nathan glanced at Lila. She sprang to her feet, the teddy bear dangling from her hand. Her small fingers clenched tighter as Dr. Mallory's eyes sought consent. Nathan gave a small nod, an unspoken order to move forward. Inside, the room was brighter than the corridor, white light falling across pale bedding. Marianne lay on her side, oxygen tube over her nose, her skin washed out but her eyes fully open, fixed on the small figure coming closer. Lila advanced with the bear still tucked under her arm. Marian slowly raised a trembling hand, fingers searching for the smaller ones. Nathan stayed in the doorway, keeping the space for them, but his gaze never left Marianne's movements. When mother and daughter's fingers touched, he could see life seep back in. Not loudly, not brilliantly, but like a flame cupped safely between two hands. Marianne's voice was weak, nearly lost under the monitor's beeps. "I'm sorry, sweetheart." Lila shook her head, lips pressed together, and Nathan knew she was holding her words in to keep them from breaking into sobs. A moment later, Marianne turned her gaze to him. "Thank you for listening to her," she said, each word spent like the last of her breath. He only dipped his head. In the service, there were thank yous that didn't need answering. Bringing someone back intact was the answer. But here, his throat felt dry, and he had to draw a slow breath to keep his voice steady. "No need to thank me. We're not done yet." Marianne closed her eyes, exhausted but without the morning's fear. Lila placed the bear on the bed beside her mother's shoulder and stayed standing, both hands resting on the bed rail, as if to keep the world from sliding away. In that stance, Nathan glimpsed his own daughter years ago, how a child could put their whole body into anchoring a single moment. Dr. Mallory motioned for Nathan to step out so Marianne could rest. He backed away, letting Lila settle into the chair by the bed. When the door closed, the heaviness in his shoulder and arm finally pressed in. Evelyn approached, her voice low. "Better," she said. "But this is only the outer ring." He nodded, no argument. What he just witnessed wasn't just a visit. It was the reason to stay, proof that what they were protecting was more than a custody case. It was a lifeline for both mother and daughter. From inside, the monitor beeped steadily, so steady it felt like a small but stubborn promise. Nathan looked at the frosted glass panel, at the shadow of Lila sitting close to the bed, her hand in her mother's. He knew there would be more meetings ahead, cold eyes, clipped phrases, but this image would be the order he carried without needing it in writing. Keep those two hands from being parted again. In that quiet, Nathan realized his resolve had shifted. It was no longer the reflex of a soldier shaped by loss, but the choice of a man who knew the cost of turning away. And once chosen, he would hold that position, just as he had that morning on the narrow street, when a small hand gripped his and whispered 7 words that tied him to this story. He stood a moment longer at the glass before returning to the hallway seats. Now he had 2 reasons to remain: a plea hidden in a teddy bear's stuffing, and the moment a mother's eyes opened to find her daughter right there. Both were fragile, but for Nathan, they were enough to face any wind waiting outside. Early in the afternoon, the light in the corridor shifted to a milky, opaque white. The air conditioning breathed evenly. The smell of antiseptic clung to the metal armrests, seeped into Nathan's jacket, threaded into his hair. He sat upright in the row of chairs against the wall, eyes still fixed on the frosted ICU window. Inside, Marianne had drifted back into sleep after the strain of waking, her hands still clasping Lila's beneath the thin blanket. The teddy bear lay at the edge of the pillow, its frayed ear angled toward the ceiling like a torn sail. Evelyn had stepped out to deal with the next round of paperwork. Dr. Mallory had gone back to her rounds, her footfalls dry and light. Everything had settled, like a lake surface just after the wind stops. Nathan allowed himself one deeper breath, the sense of his shoulders lowering slightly. The peace was as thin as an eggshell, but enough for someone to set down a hot cup of water without fear of it spilling. The sound reached him before the man appeared, the deliberate rhythm of hard heels on tile. Neither fast nor slow, each strike exact. It was followed by the muted whine of the revolving door and a different current of air carrying a scent that didn't belong here. Nathan looked up. A man stepped from the bright end of the hall, stopping where the overhead light threw his shadow long and dark like a spill of ink. White shirt, deep blue tie, lapels pressed flat. The faint scent of aftershave, sharp as the point of a blade. Silas Hart didn't need directions. One glance at the signage, the ease of someone used to polished floors and automatic doors. His eyes passed over Nathan without pausing, fastening instead on the frosted glass. Inside, Lila straightened instinctively, a movement so slight Nathan caught it only at the edge of his vision. She didn't speak, but her shoulders drew in, both hands seizing the teddy bear as if to cover an empty spot on her chest. The ICU door opened with a press of the button. No greetings, no pause. Silas crossed the threshold as though from one conference room to another. The white light caught the edge of his tie, making it flash like a thin blade. Nathan followed a half-pace behind, close enough that the distance between them couldn't stretch too far. Marianne startled at the first footfall in the room. She opened her eyes halfway, pupils shifting before fixing on the familiar outline. Not a cry-out fear, but the older kind that moves straight into the muscles, shoulders tightening, the veins rising in the knuckles under the blanket. The oxygen tube trembled briefly with a sharper breath, then forced itself back to evenness. Silas stopped at the foot of the bed. He didn't ask after her, didn't check the monitors. His gaze swept like an inventory, bed, equipment, then the child. Lila didn't move, only hugged the bear tighter, chin pressed into its worn head to keep from shaking. No one spoke. The silence in the room felt solid, holding each person at a fixed remove. His hand moved quick and sure, the practiced gesture of clearing an object from a desk. He gripped the bear by its back and pulled it from Lila's arms. Not rough enough to be called violent, but certain and cold, a decision signed without discussion. The rasp of worn fabric against skin made Nathan's teeth clamp together. The old tear along the ear split with a dry snap, the triangular scrap of fabric flipping loose, a tuft of white stuffing poking from the seam. Lila didn't cry. Her whole body simply folded in, like someone had yanked the blanket away on a winter night. Her eyes widened dry, and that hurt Nathan more than any sob could have. Silas turned the bear in his hands, as if it were something to be put in order. His thumb ran down the torn seam, a flicker of distaste narrowing the bridge of his nose. Not pity for a damaged toy, but irritation at the disorder. The expression read, clearly, old enough to be rid of such things. Words like that didn't need to be spoken to fill the air. Marian tried to sit up. She was so weak the motion only rumpled the blanket. The oxygen line drew taut, the skin over her cheekbones bleaching whiter. Her gaze shot to the hand holding the bear, then to Lila, wanting to put herself between them, but her body lagged far behind her will. Nathan stayed by the door, but his stillness had coiled into compression. He studied everything. Silas's knuckle joints, the fold at his elbow, the span from the bed's edge to the man's polished shoe. Not to strike, but to know exactly where to stand and where not to give ground. Every detail settled into place like coordinates. Lila reached out, not to snatch the bear back, only to touch the flap of torn ear still hanging from its head. A last effort to hold onto a part of herself as it slipped away. Her hand froze in midair when Silas turned his wrist, the bear giving a small swing, the loose ear dropping fully, falling onto the bedspread before sliding to the floor. The sound was thin as a period falling into the middle of a sentence. Nathan had seen moments like this, when a person could turn a room cold without raising their voice or breaking a thing, just by removing something from where it belonged. Often, later, no one remembered exactly what had been taken, only the empty space where it had sat, and from there, the world of someone leaking away piece by piece. Here, the space was visible, a hole in the toy's head and in a child's eyes. Dr. Mallory appeared in the doorway. She didn't speak, just scanned the room. The monitor steady, but the patient's breathing changed. She plucked a tissue from a box and bent to retrieve the ear from the floor, not to dry tears, but to set the scrap on the bedside table, flipped over, as if to cover what had just happened. A small, overly polite gesture for a battered toy, but enough for Nathan to know which side she'd chosen. Silas adjusted his tie, pushing the knot snug under his collar. The motion clicked the air, shut another notch. He placed the bear at the foot of the bed, not back in the child's arms. Lila's gaze followed, her slight shoulders sinking, then snapping back as if reminding herself to sit straight in front of a stranger. Marianne's mouth opened, but only a dry gust came out. She looked at her daughter, lips shaping an apology she couldn't voice. Nathan caught that look. It didn't ask for pardon. It asked for someone to put the world back in order. Teddy in the child's hands, a mother's breath unspurred by hard heels, a hospital room that didn't double as a boardroom. The air conditioning kept its steady rhythm. Silas's shadow stretched long over the bedspread. A nurse passed the doorway, glanced in, and slipped past, practiced in the hospital art of not disturbing a room leaning one way. Inside Nathan, the fragile morning joy, when a small hand had found his in the street, took a hard crosswind. But it didn't go out. The gust only pressed the flame lower and bluer, tight to the wick. The will to protect coiled in on itself, solid and quiet. His body settled into the choice of a fixed position, like a brace wedged into a wall just starting to crack. Silas turned as if to leave, then paused half a beat, eyes flicking once more to Lila, a measuring glance to see if the distance was sufficient. The child's eyes never left her mother's hand. All that remained of an ordinary afternoon, the clink of a spoon in a plastic cup, the gleam of light on a button, suddenly felt unbearably fragile. Nathan took a step into the room, far enough that his shadow fell across the bed's edge where the bear sat askew. He touched no one, spoke nothing, but his presence altered the geometry. The straight line between Silas and the child now bent at an angle. The little ear's scrap lay on the table, still face down, like a small flag waiting to be raised again. The air was thick enough to hear one's own heartbeat. Lila eased her hand from the bed rail to rest on her mother's wrist, as if checking that the pulse still ran steady. Marianne exhaled a long, thin breath, her eyelids fluttering. Dr. Mallory leaned in to adjust the oxygen line, her glance skimming past Nathan to rest on Lila for a fraction longer than usual. Out in the corridor, a water cart rolled by, its wheels squeaking. The ordinary sound slipped into the room like a reminder that the world still moved, but here, things had just shifted off their axis. Sometimes, to put them right again, you didn't need speeches or noise, only to set a toy back in its rightful hands and to stand your body in the way of a straight path. Nathan looked at the skewed bear, the ear scrap on the table, the small hand on the mother's wrist. In his mind, the unspoken words stacked into a single order. The next move wouldn't need volume. It would need something quiet but certain, like sliding a bolt into place. And he already knew what he would do, as soon as the breathing of all three in the room found the same rhythm again. Nathan stepped fully into the space between the hospital bed and the exit, unhurried, unshowy, as if merely shifting for a clear view of the heart rate monitor. But the geometry had changed. For Silas to reach Lila, or the bear, or simply reclaim the open ground, he would now have to go around Nathan. He bent and picked up the bear from the foot of the bed. The tear at its ear made it go slack in his hand, releasing the faint smell of old stuffing mixed with toaster smoke when he brought it close. Nathan turned it once in his palm, then set it in Lila's lap without asking. Her small hands closed over it once, her chin coming to rest on its head. The motion was so slight that, unless you stood close, you'd miss it. But Nathan saw it clearly, an invisible thread running from bear to hand to the child's chest, now joined again. Silas tilted his head, not quite in challenge, but with a chill that had room for no one else. Nathan didn't move back. He straightened, his gaze deliberately slow in finding Silas's, like a hunter meeting the eyes of an animal to measure distance and intent. "She won't be alone again," Nathan said, his voice low and flat, like reading out a fact. Not raised, but each word landed on the room's floor like a stone on still water, sending slow, certain ripples. Marianne turned her head toward Nathan, her eyes a mix of gratitude and exhaustion. She didn't speak, didn't name names. She seemed to understand this wasn't a quarrel to be argued, but a moment to mark a boundary. Silas didn't answer right away. He adjusted his cuff, the small motion enough for Nathan to read the habit of a man used to resolving matters through the authority he carried. That decision, his look seemed to say, isn't yours. But Nathan didn't need anyone to give him permission. In the service, he'd held positions people said couldn't be held, and he'd held them anyway. This was no different. The air in the room compressed until the hum of the AC sounded like wind through a narrow gap. Lila stayed silent, her fingers tracing the frayed seam of the bear as if to steady herself. Nathan angled his head just enough to block Silas's line of sight to her. A simple move, but one that bent the straight line between the man and the child into another sharp angle. From the foot of the bed, Dr. Mallory gave a small, deliberate cough. "The patient needs rest," she said, not unkind but unmistakably clear. "Tension affects breathing. If you'd like to visit, please come back during visiting hours." Spoken like a clinical instruction, but Nathan knew it was her way of closing this encounter. Silas gave a slow nod, not meeting Nathan's eyes again. He turned, walking out. The hard soles of his shoes struck the hallway and faded into distance. The moment his shadow was gone, Marianne let out a long breath Nathan could hear over the monitor. He stayed in place a few moments more, until he felt the tightness leave Lila's shoulders. Then he stepped back, giving her room to lean against her mother without obstruction. The bear lay between them, its torn ears still dangling, but in the right place now. Evelyn returned shortly after, her eyes moving from Nathan to Marianne, noting the deeper fatigue there. Nathan didn't need to explain. The way Lila clutched the bear was enough for Evelyn to understand. "We'll talk later," she murmured, her tone carrying the certainty of someone already setting pieces for a long match. Nathan sat in the chair beside the bed, no longer turning his back to the door. He knew that next time Silas came, he might bring more than a cold look and a clipped voice. But he also knew that from now on, anyone wanting to walk straight to Lila would have to go through him. It wasn't a declaration. It was simply a fact, like the sun setting in the west. Inside him, the will to protect had shifted from reflex to commitment, like standing on a winter pass with the wind whipping at your face, yet holding steady because a whole village stands behind you. Here, Nathan's village was a hospital bed, a child with a bear, and a mother still weak. But that was enough to raise a defensive line. He glanced at Lila, then at Marianne. They didn't need to know every move he'd make. Only one thing. No one would take away these small but vital things without meeting him first. And that was a promise that needed no paperwork, no signature, only being in the right place at the right time and holding fast. The next morning, pale light spilled through the narrow hospital window, not enough to warm the air thick with antiseptic and the steady hum of machines. Nathan sat in the folding chair against the wall, hands clasped loosely, eyes flicking now and then toward the hallway. Lila still slept, her head resting on her mother's arm. Marianne was awake but silent, her gaze fixed on some point beyond the glass, as if holding on to something she couldn't let drift away. Evelyn arrived early, dew still beading her coat. She didn't offer her usual greeting. Instead, she set a thin envelope on the table beside the bed. Nathan saw the red seal and the italic print across the front. Court summons. Marian blinked slowly, then turned to Nathan as if to confirm what she already knew. He gave a brief nod. "Day after tomorrow," Evelyn said, voice even. "Preliminary hearing for temporary custody." She paused, her glance flicking to Lila before she lowered her tone. "Silas has filed for emergency custody, citing financial stability and a secure home." Marian gave a small, dry laugh, one that never reached her eyes. "Secure." She repeated the word as though tasting something long absent from her mouth, familiar and strange at once, but far from pleasant. Nathan saw her shoulders draw in, not from cold, but from the thought of those fully furnished rooms devoid of warmth. Evelyn pulled a chair closer. "We need to prepare. The court will want to see proof that separating Lila from her mother right now does not serve her best interests." She opened a file folder, fanning out several sheets. "I've contacted Dr. Mallory for both the medical report and a preliminary psychological evaluation for Lila. But we also need anything we can get on the home environment she had with Silas." Marian closed her eyes and exhaled slowly. "The old house," she said softly. "Before I left, there were still security cameras." Her eyes opened, glinting with a fragile mix of hope and caution. "If they still have the footage." Nathan nodded, filing it away instantly. He didn't say so, but the decision was made. He would go this afternoon. The route to that house wasn't long, but whatever waited behind its door couldn't be predicted. Lila stirred, rubbing her eyes. The bear slid from her grasp onto the bed. Nathan picked it up and placed it back into her hands. She clutched it instinctively. When her eyes met his, no words were exchanged, but he understood. She had caught enough of the conversation to know they were nearing a turning point. Evelyn's hand came to rest lightly on Marianne's arm. The hardest part in these cases isn't proving you love your child. It's proving that love matters more than the numbers in a bank account. Her tone carried no comfort, only the worn weight of experience, dry and heavy as an old case file. Marian nodded, lips pressed thin. "I'm not afraid of him," she said. "I'm afraid they'll believe him." The words hung in the small room. No one answered, but Nathan felt them settle like an anchor in all their minds. The hospital intercom called Dr. Mallory to another case. She stopped in first, handing Evelyn a freshly printed report. "Vitals are better this morning, but she still needs rest. Don't let the stress drag out." Her eyes cut briefly to Nathan, a silent reminder of how taut the thread of Marianne's health was right now. When Dr. Mallory left, the room went quiet again. Nathan felt the weight of the summons sitting on the table. It wasn't just paper. It was a formal declaration of battle, stamped and dated, capable of severing mother from daughter with a single cold ruling. He stood, pulling on his jacket. "I'll be back before dinner," he said, offering no details. Evelyn only nodded, knowing he was going after something no testimony or report could replace. Marianne's lips moved, but but formed no sound. Nathan turned just long enough to see a faint spark of trust in her eyes, somewhere between worry and exhaustion. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to drive him out the door toward whatever waited. The morning corridor was quieter than usual. Passing the nurse's station, he felt curious glances follow him, then paused by the ICU window for one last look. Lila had leaned against her mother again, the bear tucked between them. The sight, fragile and still, imprinted in his mind like a photograph he wouldn't let anyone touch. Outside, the early wind was cold and dry, scattering the last leaves of autumn. Nathan pulled his collar high and crossed the lot to where the pickup waited. The summons might still be on the hospital table, but to him, the clock it started was already ticking. Every minute was a step closer to a courtroom where strangers who had never spent a winter evening in that old house, never listened to the breathing of a child asleep because her mother was near, would decide their fate. He turned the ignition. The engine's growl was low and steady. Ahead lay the road out of town, looping around the ridge, then angling into the suburb where the house Marianne had walked away from still stood. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down on the rooftops. Nathan tightened his grip on the wheel, running through the plan in his head. Find it, take it, bring it back. Because when they stood before the judge, they would need more than words to preserve the scene he'd just seen through that glass. And he knew there was no retreat in this fight. The summons was only the beginning. The determination to keep them together was what would carry him through. The afternoon sagged over the hills like a gray blanket. The road out to the suburbs was almost empty, a strip of dark asphalt unspooling past faded picket fences. Nathan cracked the window just enough to let the cold in, keeping himself alert the old way, letting the wind strip the noise from his thoughts until only the spine of the task remained. He slowed when the house numbers began to thin, until the slope rose ahead and revealed a wooden house leaning slightly into the soft earth. No barked. Only a shell wind chime under the porch eaves hung silent, despite wind strong enough to snap his jacket against his ribs. In the front window, a sun-bleached private property sign was taped crooked. The front door was locked. On the porch steps, the boards were worn concave from old footsteps, dust lying evenly across them like powdered chalk. From the porch edge, he spotted it. A small black dome camera under the roofline's left corner, its status light faint as a dying breath. His gaze followed the cable along the eave, into the siding, disappearing behind the electric meter. Around the sidewall, a strip of clapboard led to a narrow path at the back, where a gray utility box was bolted outside the fence line. It sat flush to the public walkway, not inside any locked gate. The lid hung loose on its hinges from years of wind, leaving a thin gap along the bottom. Standing in the walkway, Nathan eased a hand to it. The lid lifted with no sound, no lock. Inside sat a recorder no bigger than his palm, cables neatly plugged in. On its side, a memory card slot protruded slightly, the tiny latch nudged right. He leaned in and flicked it left, hearing a dry click, nothing like the force of breaking in, more like opening an old tin someone had forgotten to seal. He paused, scanning around. The alley was empty. Tree shadows tilted slowly in the wind. He took his phone and photographed everything. Wide shot of the box in place, then close-ups of the model number, cable run, loose lid. Old soldier's habit. Leave a record, leave a trail. He pulled a card. Small, scratch plastic. In the truck, he had clear zip bags meant for spare screws. Today, one became an evidence sleeve. He brushed away dust, slid the card inside, added a scrap of paper marked with date, time, and location. West Side Alley, outside fence. He sealed it with masking tape, drew a pin line across the seam so any tampering would break it. The phone buzzed. Evelyn. Got it, he said. Leave it intact, she replied crisply. No direct viewing. Bring it in, I'll draft the preservation order. We copy first, seal the original. The call ended as cleanly as a nod across a conference table. Nathan replaced the box lid, pressed it tight, took one last photo. He didn't enter the yard, didn't touch the door. From the porch's edge, he looked through the dusty window into the dim interior. A small wooden table, a tilted chair, a stripe of old sunlight across the floor. It felt like the house still held breath, but he knew it was just the stubborn shadow of old routines. In his mind, he could already see the porch column where a child might once have hidden, not from memory, but as if a future recollection was already forming. On the walk back to the truck, he glanced in the tilted mailbox. Empty, save for dust and a curled dry leaf. He left it untouched. The flap shut noiselessly, as if the place was used to silent movements. The pickup rolled downhill, tires crunching stray grit in the gutter. Nathan kept the throttle steady, his mind already ahead in the small garage behind his place. A wooden shed that long ago became part workshop, part storage for old gear, empty ammo tins, rolls of duct tape, and a scarred bench he'd once planed by hand. Today, that bench would be the flat surface to lay part of this story on. The garage light flicked on, a thin amber pool. He spread an old newspaper over the bench, set the zip bag on top, and wrote on it again. Date, hour, weather location. The battered laptop took its time waking, fan pushing warm, dusty air. From a drawer, he pulled a card reader, its USB cable coiled stiff from disuse. He smoothed it straight without tugging. The phone buzzed again. A message from Evelyn. Don't open direct. Use a cloning tool. Preserve metadata. Seal the original after. He nodded to himself. He loaded a lightweight recovery tool he'd once used to help a neighbor salvage photos. The progress bar crept forward, swallowing data in small bites, spitting out file names meaningless to outsiders, but to him clearly a string of dates and hours, anchors for a trap story. The fan's hum was steady as breath. Nathan watched the screen's pale glow slide over the ridged skin of his knuckles. On the wall, an old jacket hung with its sleeve exposing the crude hand-stitch he'd put in years ago. His fingers tapped the bench's edge, same way a man taps his foot before taking a curve. In his ears, the hospital sounds returned. Monitor beeps, Marianne's shallow breath, Lila's fingernail on chair's rim. Small things, but the reason he was here. At 100%, the file list appeared, video segments marked by timestamps. Night, morning, midday, night again. He didn't open them. He made a second copy to an external drive, labeled it, taped the seam, signed across it. The original's bag went into a wooden box with a metal clasp, locked shut. A small ritual for something fragile. Dusk thickened outside. Dust motes floated in the amber light like rain held in place. Nathan stood, stretched the stiffness from his shoulders, poured water into a dented steel mug, drank. The water was cool, but his throat warmed, not from it, but from knowing, when they opened those files, what they needed might be there, clear as rain soaking a coat. 10 minutes, Evelyn texted. Okay, he replied. He allowed himself only this before she arrived. Open the copies folder, sort newest to oldest, jot in his notebook the times that might match Marianne's memory. No sentences, just dots and arrows. A car pulled up. The garage door creaked as a chill draft slipped in with a scent of wood smoke. Evelyn stepped inside, flicking water from her cuff. Her eyes went from the locked box to the sign tape on the drive. No praise, no instructions, just a nod, like a cog slotting into place. They sat side by side, screen light flattening their features. Evelyn set her notebook aside, hand poised on the table edge without touching the keys. Nathan opened the copy, the cursor hovering over a clip stamped with a late-day sun, then moving to one marked at the far edge of night. He didn't hit play. Not yet. He took a breath, the way you do before squeezing a trigger. Outside, wind combed through dry branches, making a sound like someone turning a large page. Inside, everything held still. Nathan looked at the clock as the minute hand slid past 12. His finger rested on the spacebar. He looked up. Evelyn met his eyes and gave the faintest nod. Not urging, just confirming. That morning's quiet resolve had ripened into something else, a readiness. The paper hidden inside the stuffed bear, the child's hand clutching his on the street, Marianne's weak breath, all of it lined up to this point. Gather the truth, not for credit, but to defend the small things struggling for air. He pressed. The screen flickered, the frame opening into the fisheye shimmer. But he stopped at the first image, porch corner, weathered post, a still yard. He exited, flagged the clip. This one, he said quietly, tomorrow. Evelyn closed her notebook and exhaled. They sealed the drive, marked the hour, neat as loading rounds into a fresh magazine. Nathan powered down the screen. Amber light reclaimed the room. He saw Evelyn out to the door, listening to her car fade away. In the garage, there was only wind and dry wood. The original lay locked away, the copy labeled on a shelf, pen lines crisp on the tape. Nathan sat back down, arms loose at his sides. In the quiet, he knew they'd pulled a shard of truth out of stillness. The rest would wait for morning, when they'd open it and let the light fall exactly where it needed to. The next morning, fog lay thick over the town like a white scarf pulled tight. The light through the garage window fell in gray bands, neither fully day nor still night. Nathan sat alone at the workbench, the external drive resting beside a leather notebook. His finger turned back to the page from yesterday. Handwritten timestamps, moments Marianne had mentioned, arrows leading back to the days she and Lila were still in that house. Evelyn arrived just after 8, her coat beaded with dew, eyes carrying the alertness of someone braced for impact. "Today we watch," she said, short and flat, but with the weight of a threshold. The moment not just of opening a file, but opening a door to a story the court usually ignores. Nathan plugged in the drive. The screen lit, the folder appeared. He moved the cursor to the clip he'd marked the night before. Timestamp: an early autumn afternoon, about 4:30, light fading toward evening. He clicked. The fisheye porch camera ballooned open, weathered grain on the post, the small front yard, beyond the gate a strip of empty asphalt. 10 seconds, nothing but dry leaves shifting in the wind. Then, from the left edge, a small figure. Lila, no mistaking her. In a thin sweater, clutching the stuffed bear, she stepped slow, stopped, pressed her back against the porch post. Only half her face was visible, but her eyes tilted toward the gate as if testing which way the wind carried scent. 20 seconds later, a dark car pulled up, stopped at the gate. The driver's door opened. Silas stepped out, upright, measured, neither fast nor slow. He didn't look around, didn't call out. Just shut the door, locked it, and walked straight for the gate. Lila's shoulders hunched, arms locking the bear tighter, fingers worrying the worn ear seam. Her gaze dropped, but her body stayed pressed to the post. When Silas reached the porch steps, the space between them shrank to a few paces. She edged back half a step until it met her spine, her eyes wide. Not the startle of surprise, but the wide stillness of bracing for impact and refusing to look away. There was no audio, yet Nathan and Evelyn both felt the silence. Thick, heavy, a silence that needed no raised voice to fill the air. Silas passed her without slowing, hand brushing the door, pushing it open, disappearing inside. Lila stayed on the porch a few seconds more, unmoving, watching after him like someone measuring the wind after the storm has already stepped into the house. Nathan stopped the clip there. He didn't need more to understand. Evelyn sat straighter, palm on her own notebook. "This moment," she said slowly, "has no sound, no court-ready definition of violence. But it holds every sign of a child living under sustained fear." Nathan nodded, eyes still on the frozen frame. In his head, Lila's posture at the porch post overlaid perfectly with that first morning on the street, her hand fisting the hem of her shirt, the dry, urgent gaze without tears. The repetition needed no further commentary. "We'll pull this segment unaltered," Evelyn said, and attached Dr. Mallory's notes on physiological stress response. "No need to dramatize. The truth's enough." Nathan saved the clip, made a duplicate, labeled it with date and time, signed it, locked it into a protective case. Each step was slow and deliberate, the way he'd once break down and reassemble a rifle on the training range. Strip, clean, reassemble, safety check. This, too, was a weapon, only it fired images instead of rounds. They spent a few more minutes skimming other clips to ensure nothing was missed. Lila sitting alone on the steps, staring at the road until the shadow crossed her face completely. Marian rushing to open the back door at the sound of a car, movements quick and practiced like someone conditioned for the inevitable. All logged, but they both knew the porch post moment was the arrowhead. When they were done, Evelyn packed her folder, her gaze never leaving the hard drive. "This," she said, "won't make the court cry, but it'll make it hard for them to say no when they look at it." Nathan understood. In a long fight, you didn't always need a sweeping victory. Sometimes you only had to force the other side to halt. Outside, the fog was thinning, revealing the ridge beyond town. Nathan saw Evelyn off, watched her car disappear around the bend, then returned to the garage. He shut off the screen, but the image of Lila clutching the bear at the porch post stayed vivid, etched deep like a fresh mark in wood grain. He knew this was only one piece. The rest would be in the room itself, holding the truth steady when it was threatened by polished words and stamped paper. But today, they'd secured a sliver of light to bring into a space usually crowded with shadows. For him, that was enough to take the next step. The morning of the hearing was as dim as glass filmed with frost. On the stone steps up to the courthouse, dry streaks of mud lay like the interrupted footprints of someone who'd passed through after a night of rain. Nathan paused beneath the wooden frame of the door, his old coat pulled close, catching the smell of damp paper and varnished wood. The wall clock made no sound, but he could still feel time slipping past, measured by a cough echoing down a side corridor, by the faint rasp of a pen moving across a record. Evelyn arrived on time, her slim case not bulging, but weighted in a different way. She gave him a nod. No need for the words ready, that had been settled long before. Marianne followed, thin as a filament about to go dark, a hospital scarf borrowed against her throat. Lila didn't go into the courtroom. She sat in a small room set aside for children, the door left ajar, a paper cup of water, and some crayons on the table. When Nathan passed, she looked up just long enough for him to catch the deliberate calm in her gaze, then bent back down, hugging the stuffed bear closer. The courtroom was small, paneled in dark wood. The flag in one corner hung slightly skewed, a crease catching the light from the ceiling. The benches still smelled faintly of fresh varnish. Silas was already there, dark tie, unreadable face. He laid his pen parallel to the edge of his file, adjusted a cuff, the habit of a man accustomed to bringing his own order into any room. Nathan didn't stare, but he knew exactly where every breath was taken. Proceedings began in the flat cadence of the clerk's reading. Words like preliminary, temporary, custody dropped like stones, quiet but not disappearing. The judge nodded once. Evelyn rose, set the small drive on the table, opened her file, a silent, steady stream of words on paper. She didn't spin a story. She drew the outline. A mother just out of critical condition, a child stable when with her and within Nathan's line of sight. The request to maintain that safe structure until full evaluation. Dr. Mallory took the witness stand, her lab coat creased sharply at the wrist under the lights. She spoke like reciting lab results, nothing added, nothing withheld. When Lila was in proximity to an adult male of Silas's build, her heart rate rose, her palms went cold. She ate and slept better when Nathan was within sight. Removing her from her mother during recovery risked worsening Marianne's respiratory stability. Each sentence ended in a period, never an exclamation. Evelyn didn't cut in. She placed another sheet on the table. Notes from the previous evening, certifying the camera footage had been preserved. When she tapped the screen, the fisheye porch frame appeared, weathered wood, a small yard, and a child's silhouette pressed to a post. No audio. None needed. The whole room seemed to hold its breath with the frame. Lila, clutching the bear, shoulders tucked in like a leaf folding before cold wind. A car stops. Silas crosses the frame, unhurried. She steps back half a pace, wood at her spine. The door opens. The image freezes. Evelyn didn't press play. She let the silence do the rest. Silas inclined his head, recovering his voice as if picking up a fallen cufflink. No violence, merely a misreading of a still moment. He spoke of stability, good schools, health insurance. Words polished to a gloss, like the courtroom table surface. Nathan listened, eyes on the screen gone dark. When the judge turned to their side, Evelyn spoke just loud enough. Request the court to weigh visible psychological harm, even without bruises. Request that Marianne keep temporary custody, and that Silas's private contact be limited until evaluation was complete. Her tone neither shook nor hardened. It ran straight, like the white line between lanes and fog. The judge looked to Dr. Mallory again. The doctor's hand rested still on the stand. She nodded once, precise, as if she had weighed the room's contents. Only then did Nathan speak. He didn't approach the bench, didn't seek the mic. Just leaned enough for his voice to cross the gap. Fear that deep, he said slowly, doesn't need bruises to prove it. The words lay down like a thin sheet of lead, not bright but heavy. Silas didn't answer. He turned his pen once between his fingers, a movement long practiced to keep from showing restlessness. Chairs shifted faintly on the floor. The judge leaned back, glanced once more at the drive, then wrote a few short lines. No ruling yet. Only the next order, a closed interview with Lila in a private room. Only the interviewer and recorder present before day's end. Dr. Mallory's supplemental report to be attached. Temporary custody unchanged until the child's voice was heard. Evelyn nodded to Nathan, a quiet, "That's as good as we get today." Marian exhaled, the sigh thin as thread, but whole from start to finish. Nathan glanced toward the small room. Through the frosted panel, he saw Lila's outline sitting straight, crayons lined along the table edge, the bear face down, its frayed ear aimed at the door, a small signal no one in court would notice but him. As they left, Silas passed close, the scent of aftershave sliding by, sharp as the brush of a blade. Nathan didn't step back. He stood still, keeping the space between his worn coat and Silas's pressed lapel exactly one breath wide. In that breath, he understood. This fight would have no smoke, no blast. Only long mornings like this, silent frames, signatures in the right places, and short sentences carrying a life's weight. The corridor outside was brighter. A bar of pale sun fell across the stone floor, warm enough to loosen a hand's grip. Evelyn went ahead to arrange the interview. Marianne rested on a bench, eyes closed but the knot between her brows easing. Nathan stood as a windbreak, back to the door, the habit of a man who's kept watch on a post. At the far end, a small door opened, closed again. Soon there'd be a deep voice asking, a pen scratching, and the faint inhale of a child reaching for words to hold her fear. Nathan couldn't go in. His work was outside, keeping the world quiet enough for that fragile thing to form, keeping the small joy of being together from being blown out by cold legal phrasing. He rested a hand on the bench's arm, eyes on the stripe of sunlight. In his head, a plan without a map. If they tried to change terms this afternoon, he'd be here with Evelyn. If more medical files were needed, he'd find Dr. Mallory. If Lila needed someone waiting at the door, he'd be that person. No orders, just a chain of standing in the right place. A draft from a single hallway door lifted the corner of a clerk's paper, then let fall. Nathan watched it like an old watchman might watch a small flag at an outpost. The wind was still there, but the pole hadn't broken. He closed his hands lightly, not to ready for a fight, but to remind himself. Resolve now meant keeping rhythm. The mother's breathing, the child's gaze, the steady pace of doing the right thing, fully enough. And he would be here until that voice was heard, whole, without being drowned out. The child interview room was on the second floor, away from the courthouse's main hallway noise. The door was painted a pale blue, the hinges so smooth that when the social worker pushed it open, the only sound was her shoes on the floor. Inside, a low wooden table, chairs sized for children, a short bookshelf with a few worn comic books. In the corner, a box of colored pencils and blank paper. No exposed microphones, just a small recorder tucked away, its red light off so as not to catch the child's attention. Lila sat on the edge of her chair, feet swinging to tap lightly against each other. The stuffed bear was on her lap, her hand covering its frayed ear, as if afraid it might overhear something it shouldn't. The social worker, a woman with cropped hair, a beige sweater, sat across from her, holding a pencil instead of a pen, avoiding the formality of signing anything. Her voice was low and steady. You can tell me anything you want. No one here will yell at you. At first, Lila only looked down at the table, tracing a crescent-shaped scratch in the wood. She scraped at some dust with a fingernail, stopped, and hugged the bear tighter. It was a long while before the pencil's faint scratching resumed. Notes, not questions, filling the silence. At the old house, Lila began, her voice thin as a drawn thread. When he came home, Mom didn't talk. She just looked at the floor or into the sink. And me, she swallowed, blinked fast. I went to the bathroom, locked the door, sat on the mat. Her hand stilled on the bear for a beat, then squeezed harder. There was a fan in there. That sound covered up all the other sounds. The social worker didn't interrupt, only nodded, her eyes fixed on the girl's face. Lila went on, slower. He never hit me, but he looked at me. She lifted her head slightly, and for a moment the cold steel of memory showed in her gaze. Like I was something wrong in his house. A short sentence, but in the room it settled like fine dust into every corner. Out in the hallway, Nathan sat upright on the bench, hands clasped. The door was closed, but he could picture Lila's posture, leaning a little, chin down, the bear always in hand. He'd seen children in war zones clutch small things, not because they were precious, but because they were the last latch between them and whatever loomed. Evelyn stood near the door, jotting in her notebook when the pencil sounds inside paused, then resumed. She knew how to read an interview's rhythm. Long silences weren't always roadblocks. Sometimes they were moments when the speaker was setting fragile pieces on the table, careful not to break them. Inside, the social worker asked, "How do you feel when you're with your mom?" Lila lifted her head for the first time to meet her gaze. "Safe, but I'm scared if he comes, Mom will go quiet again, and I'll have to find a place where I can't hear the door." She looked down, drawing a small circle on the bear's back with her finger. "I don't want to leave her behind. I don't want her alone." The pencil rasped again. A faint red light flicked on in the recorder, unnoticed by anyone but the operator in the corner. Lila's voice wasn't loud or trembling, but it carried a strange weight, the kind that comes when a child has learned to measure the air before speaking. Nathan heard a chair shift inside, then silence. He let out a slow breath, as if blurring one of his own memories. In his mind, the picture of her that first morning on the street rose again. The 7 whispered words, her small hand in his. Now that same hand gripped the bear, holding back a different shape of the same fear. When the door opened, Lila stepped out, eyes a little red but dry. She went straight to Nathan, said nothing, just switched the bear to her other arm, so her free hand could rest lightly on his sleeve. A short touch, like telling him she was still here, intact, after laying some vital part of herself on that low table. Evelyn followed, a small nod telling him it was clear enough for the report. Marianne waited at the hall's end, her expression a mix of worry and relief. Lila ran to her, hugging tight. No words, only the sound of fabric brushing and breaths falling into the same rhythm. On their way out of the courthouse, Nathan walked last. He scanned the space, recalling every face in that morning's courtroom. The way Silas had looked at the video, the judge's brief nod. He kept each detail like marking coordinates on a map. The road ahead wasn't straight, but now there was a landmark, the testimony of a child, without tears, just truth laid bare enough that no one listening could turn away. Outside, the wind had shifted. Dry leaves rolled in small clusters along the sidewalk, whispering against each other. Nathan pulled his collar high, walking behind the mother and daughter, far enough back to see their shadows merge on the sun-stained pavement. And in that moment, he knew he'd be standing in many more hallways, waiting on many more doors to open and close, until that sense of safety no longer had to be measured by the steps from the dinner table to the bathroom. That afternoon, the sky was covered with a pale gray layer of clouds, the sunlight not strong enough to warm the pavement. In the courtroom, yellow light spilled down on the long table between the 2 rows of seats. Nathan sat in the back row with Marianne and Evelyn, his back resting lightly against the bench, his hands on his knees. He had a habit of surveying the room before anything took place. The way the curtains hung, the position of each chair, the low murmur from the clerk's desk. Those small details kept his mind from getting pulled into emotions too soon. Silas entered from the side door, his tie neatly adjusted, his expression unchanged. He sat opposite them, placing his black briefcase down and locking it carefully. Everything about him radiated control, steady breathing, eyes sweeping quickly over each person without lingering. Nathan realized it wasn't calmness, but a kind of active defense. The judge opened the file, her voice even as she read the summary. Dr. Mallory's medical report, an excerpt from the security camera footage, and a transcript of Lila's interview. No commentary, just a list, but each item like a stone placed on the scales. Evelyn leaned toward Marianne, murmuring something, perhaps reminding her to breathe. Evelyn stood first. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear and steady. She repeated the request to maintain Marianne's temporary custody, based on the confirmed psychological risk and the need for stability in a safe environment. She didn't describe emotions, only cited each detail. Heart rate readings, physiological responses, verbatim testimony. When she referred to the video, she paused on a still frame. Lila pressed against the porch post, the teddy bear covering one side of her chest. This, she said, is a child trying to make herself smaller inside her own home. Silas replied in an unhurried voice. He spoke of financial capacity, of living conditions, of never having been convicted or investigated. He didn't deny that the child might feel afraid, but claimed it was the misunderstanding of a child that it's an adult's responsibility to correct such misconceptions. Every word he chose was polished smooth, leaving no sharp edges. The judge sat silent, not interrupting. Nathan noticed Marianne's hand gripping the edge of the seat, knuckles widening. He shifted his shoulders slightly, so his hand brushed hers, a presence more than a word. Evelyn countered, basing her argument on the concept of invisible harm that the law allows to be considered in exceptional cases. Then the judge asked, "Anything further before I make a temporary ruling?" Evelyn nodded to Nathan. He rose and walked to the podium, carrying no papers. He spoke slowly and clearly. "I was there when the girl spoke the first 7 words to me that morning. The same hand today is still gripping a teddy bear to block out the sound of a door opening. I'm not here to compete for her. I'm here to make sure that what scares her doesn't get another chance to be near her." He stopped there, adding nothing more. The courtroom stayed silent for a long beat. Then the judge leaned down, wrote a few lines, and signed. The court rules to maintain temporary custody with Ms. Marianne Hart. Mr. Silas Hart will be allowed visitation only under the supervision of a social worker. This order will remain in effect until the formal hearing takes place. The parties will be notified of the specific date and time. The gavel struck lightly on the desk, not loud but enough to make everyone rise. Marianne exhaled as if releasing a heavy load. Evelyn squeezed her shoulder, giving Nathan a small nod. Silas packed his papers slowly, his face unchanged, but the way he clicked the briefcase shut was just slightly harder than when he had opened it. Out in the hallway, Nathan saw Lila waiting with a court officer. When she saw her mother, she ran over, hugging her tightly, then looked up at him. She didn't smile, but her gaze softened, as though some of the weight had lifted from her small shoulders. He gave her a single nod, enough to say, "We kept today." Outside the courthouse, the wind carried the smell of damp earth. The three of them stood for a moment on the steps, not in a hurry to leave. Nathan knew this wasn't the end. Ahead lay more hearings, more repeated questions, more scrutinizing looks. But today, they had preserved the safe distance between Lila and what made her shrink into herself. As they descended the stone steps, Nathan walked on the outside, moving slowly to shield them from the wind. He glanced briefly at Marianne, her eyes tired but no longer wide with fear, and at Lila, her small hand clutching the edge of her mother's coat. In that moment, he remembered a saying from the army: "Hold your position until you're relieved." Here, there would be no relief coming, and he knew he would stay in that position for as long as needed. The days after the ruling passed slowly and quietly, like a shallow stream finding its bed again. The hospital discharged Marianne with a few instruction sheets, some pills in a paper envelope, and a follow-up appointment from Dr. Mallory. The Riverside Community Center took her and Lila into a short-term support program. A small room behind the kitchen, its window looking out over a lawn of bare roots, just big enough for 2 single beds, a folding table, and a metal shelf. The bedding smelled of detergent. The baseboards carried the damp wood scent of the old building. The first night, Lila slept facing the wall, the teddy bear between them like a gentle border. The door closed without a sharp click. Nathan had fixed a thin strip of felt to the hinge before letting go of the handle. In the mornings, the kitchen lights came on early, neon tubes buzzing before settling into silence. Marianne stood behind the counter, learning to use the inventory sheet. How many cans of beans, how many sacks of flour, what time the milk crates came in. Opening the onion crate stung her eyes, but her hands stayed steady. The knife on the cutting board marked time in an even rhythm. The chicken soup simmered in the corner, steam curling into her hair, leaving salt and fat on her sleeves. Her hands were still thin, but they grew steadier by the day. Each afternoon she penciled a neat check beside the job she'd finished. Nathan didn't work in the kitchen, but was always somewhere in the background, replacing a cracked washer in his sink, tightening a loose hinge, sanding down a table edge so it wouldn't catch skin. He kept the toolbox by the back door, a rag hanging on a nail. He didn't say much, usually just a nod, and after tightening the last screw, he'd test the door. The scrape gone, like a thorn pulled from a small wound. At midday, Lila sat at the folding table by the window, practicing careful letters that stayed small within the ruled lines. The teddy bear lay beside her, its ears sewn back with dark brown thread. Nathan's stitch work was clumsy, but it would hold. Her colored pencils lined up like a tiny platoon. She ate soup from the kitchen in slow spoonfuls, glancing often toward the doorway where Marianne appeared now and then, hair carrying a trace of onions. Evelyn stopped by after work with a slim folder and a short list of signatures needed. The printed words were cold, but in her hands they became steps: supervised visitation schedule, follow-up medical appointments, proof of residency forms. "We go one step at a time," she said, setting her pen on the table, her fingers unhurried, like showing someone how to ease a rope out instead of yanking. Nathan listened and nodded. Marianne signed, biting her lip to steady it, then placed the pen back exactly where it had been. By evening, the kitchen emptied. Pots sat inverted, drying. The wall clock crept past 4. Nathan walked them back to the little room, turning the window latch so the wind wouldn't whistle, sticking a strip of cloth under a bed leg so it could slide without scraping. Lila pulled an old book from her backpack, its cover now reinforced with fresh tape. The dented corner lay flat enough to turn without tearing. She read beside her mother, finger trailing the lines. Whenever she stumbled, she glanced up. Nathan answered with a nod or a quiet word. He never hurried her. Dinner returned before the paperwork did. Marianne set 2 bowls of soup on the folding table with a few slices of dry toast. Steam blurred the window. Lila blew on her spoonfuls, careful in a way learned from cold mornings without a heated kitchen. Nathan sat on a plastic chair, not eating, sipping warm water to keep his place in the room. A small adjustment here, pushing the salt farther from the table's edge, moving an unused fork aside, turning the cup to Lila's dominant hand. No one asked for these things, but someone noticed. When the dishes were done, Marianne wiped the table in steady circles, drawing a clean border around the day. Night settled slow and thick. The pipes expanded and shrank in the walls with sounds like faint hallway footsteps, but then fell quiet. Lila slept deeply, breathing warm against her pillow. No startle at a door noise. No sprint to the bathroom to sit with the teddy on the mat. The room's door shut heavy and sure. The floor underfoot felt like it had grown a thicker layer. Nathan sat on a folding chair just outside the back porch, listening to the kitchen fan hum, watching the stripe of yellow light fall on the steps. He wasn't on guard duty in the old sense, just keeping the rhythm of a home that had only just learned to breathe. On a weekend morning, frost lingered on the grass, footprints dark where someone had stepped. Nathan brought scrap wood and built a low shelf by the window for Lila's books and Teddy. He measured with a frayed cord, cut the planks gently, joined them with corner brackets. Lila stood watching, hands in her sweater pockets, sometimes touching the grain. When the shelf stood solid, she set the teddy on the second tier, facing her mother's bed like a sentry that never slept. Marianne left earlier now. She had a kitchen pass with her name printed on thin plastic. Standing to sort vegetables on a high shelf, her arms bore the weight better than a week ago. When someone asked for the newly sharpened knife, she handed it over without taking her eyes off the pot. At the start of each shift, she wrote 3 things she was grateful for in her notebook. The water boiled quickly. The shelf no longer wobbled. Lila finished her bowl. Her script was straight, no tremor like before. Midday, Dr. Mallory stopped by, checking the weariness still in Marianne's eyes, scheduling a light follow-up. She stood in the doorway without staying long, reminding quietly, "Don't push past what your body allows." Then, as if knowing too many words could weigh the room down, she left with a small nod. Nathan watched her go, appreciating how people who know their work can leave without a sound. Some afternoons, nothing notable happened, and in those times, the small changes held. Lila's quick laugh at pronouncing a strange word correctly, the water cooler no longer leaking, the felt strip keeping the wind from slamming the door. Nathan added padding to the bottom of the trash bin so it landed without a thud. He swapped in a warmer light bulb in the small room so it didn't glare. He showed Lila how to adjust her backpack straps so her stomach didn't carry all the weight. No chalkboards or grades, but the result was clear, a child walking straighter down the hallway. Sometimes Evelyn stayed after hours, pulling from her bag Marianne's first pay envelope. Not much, but enough for a box of milk and a bag of apples. Lila chose the smallest apple, washed it, bit it, and offered the other half to her mother like a sharing ritual. Nathan took one, peeled it with his small knife, cut it into 8 equal wedges, placing them on a plate like dividing a new map. Slow, even, nothing missing. On Sunday night, Nathan brought another roll of clear tape. He peeled away the old strips from Lila's book, replaced them with smoother pieces, pressing the edges flat. Lila watched, then wrote her name on the first page, letters standing tall. Marianne looked on, her eyes holding a kind of light that didn't come from the ceiling lamp. She folded the empty plastic bag and tucked it into a drawer as if storing something precious. 2 weeks later, dinner had an extra plate of shredded egg with green onions. Marianne worked an extra hour, her hands steady as she ladled soup for the drop-ins. Lila fell asleep faster, the teddy resting on the shelf's second tier, still watching the bed. The wind at the window was now just a familiar backdrop, free of threat. Outside on the porch, Nathan sometimes leaned against the wall, notebook open to a blank page, pen resting still. He wrote less, not because there was nothing to do, but because many things had settled into their rightful places. The new days didn't erase fear completely, but among what remained, there were firm holds, a work badge with a name, a door that shut softly, a low shelf with space for books and a bear, a bowl of soup uninterrupted by footsteps on the porch. Joy made no noise. It appeared in the smell of warm bread on the table, in the deep breathing of a sleeping child, in the smallest nod from a man at the door, sign that his quiet watch still went on, without anyone having to say so. And from there, each morning, the little room behind the kitchen woke more like a real home, with breath, with rhythm, with people who stayed because of each other. Early winter morning, The town wore a pale gray, the air carrying damp wood and early kitchen smoke. The road in front of the community center was patched with thin sheets of ice that cracked faintly underfoot. Nathan stood on the porch, hands in his coat pockets, watching Marianne lean down to adjust the straps on Lila's backpack. The girl wore a gray sweater under a deep blue puffer jacket donated by someone at the center, her hands gripping the straps close to her chest for warmth. Marianne finished fastening the straps and touched her daughter's shoulder, a wordless reminder. Lila nodded, her eyes blinking quickly against the cold. Her small hand brushed the head of the teddy bear, peeking from the side pocket of her backpack. It was still there, out of habit, but in a new position, not pressed tight against her chest for shielding, but sticking out a little, as if it too should see the outside world. The distant school bell rang, low but clear. Lila stepped down from the porch, her shoes crunching on the thin ice along the sidewalk. Marianne walked half a step behind, letting her daughter go on her own, but staying close enough to catch her if she slipped. Nathan took the outside position, between them and the street, the old patrol habit of staying closest to the danger. 2 blocks later, the schoolyard came into view, the iron gates open. Children's voices carried in the cold air, laughter mixing with white clouds of breath. Lila hesitated for half a second, her gaze sweeping the wide yard, then kept walking. By the flagpole, a blonde girl turned, calling something. Lila looked up, recognized her, and smiled. Not forced, not hurried, just a faint curve at the corner of her mouth that made it clear she'd heard her name called. Nathan watched from the gate, not going in. He let Marianne walk her into the yard, exchange a few words with the teacher, then turn back. By the time they separated, Lila was already moving with the stream of children toward the classrooms, her feet no longer sticking at the yard's edge like before. They walked back along the same road, gravel crunching under their shoes. Marianne was quiet for a while before speaking softly, as if not to break the thin stillness of the morning. She's been smiling more. Nathan only nodded, his eyes on the mountain ridge half hidden in the mist. He didn't need to say more. He had seen it the moment she looked back at the gate. Back at the center, Marianne went into the kitchen to start her shift. Nathan stayed on the porch a moment longer, still facing the direction of the school, though it was now out of sight. He remembered the first day he met Lila, her wary eyes, her cold hand gripping his on the street. Now that same hand had let go, to hold her own backpack straps and walk herself into a crowd. Not because the fear was gone, but because there were new anchors to hold on to. In the afternoon, Nathan returned to pick her up. Lila came out with 2 friends, saying something that made her small shoulders shake with laughter. Seeing Nathan, she waved, then ran toward him, quick steps, but not the kind of haste that comes from running away. He bent to take her backpack, noting the teddy bear still in its pocket, its worn ear now softer from being washed. They walked home together, Lila telling little pieces of her day, her voice even pausing now and then to recall a detail. Nathan listened without interrupting, nodding and asking a question or two when she stopped. Marianne waited in the kitchen with 3 paper cups of warm milk. The steam rose, fogging Nathan's glasses as he bent to take a sip. That evening, Lila sat at the small table, doing her reading assignment. The desk lamp cast a warm yellow pool, her shadow leaning against the wall. The teddy bear rested on the top shelf, facing the table. Marianne read the menu for the next day. Nathan checked the screws on the window hinges. No one spoke much, but the room held the sound of pencil on paper, pages turning, and a spoon stirring in a glass. At 8, Lila closed her book, put her pencil away, and climbed into bed. Marianne turned off the desk lamp, leaving the softer light from the ceiling fixture. Nathan wished her good night, then stepped onto the porch. Outside, the mist had thickened, the streetlights spilling soft halos. He sat there, hearing the laughter of children from some nearby yard, and thought of that morning, Lila turning her head and smiling when she heard her name. In the army, he'd learned there were victories without flags or bugles, just a quiet moment when you realized you'd held an important position. This morning, at the school gate, he knew it was one of those moments. And tomorrow, he would walk with him again, keeping to the street's edge out of habit, until no one needed someone to hold that position anymore. Morning lay a thin layer of frost over everything, like salt scattered by an unseen hand. The grass behind the community center bowed under ice, snapping faintly when stepped on. In the small room behind the kitchen, warmth from an old kettle rose like a quiet greeting. Nathan lit the stove, set the kettle, and waited for the familiar low rumble of its boil. On the low shelf, The teddy bear sat upright, its ear neatly stitched with dark brown thread, the work more even now after a few of his adjustments. The stuffing in its belly still held its paper-thin secret, like the cover of a school notebook. He no longer opened it. Some forms of trust needed to remain untouched, unchecked, and proven. Marianne tied her apron, her hand brushing the corner of the folding table to see if it had dried. In her small notebook, she marked her shift with a straight pen stroke. Beside it, a yellow slip was pinned under a magnet. A follow-up appointment in Dr. Mallory's slanted but steady hand, date and time unchanged. Evelyn had stopped by the night before, leaving a thin envelope on the table. Just one new confirmation sheet. The words on it were dry, but lighter when paired with her voice. Keep going like this. No one mentioned Silas anymore. His name appeared only occasionally on the supervised visitation schedule, trapped under the glossy cover of the wallboard. The days without his name marked were days the room seemed to breathe more evenly. Lila woke before the alarm. She sat up, reached for the folded sweater at the foot of her bed, and ducked her head into it like a bird into a newly lined nest. A strand of hair fell over her forehead. She flicked it away, then slipped on her backpack. The teddy bear was placed in the side pocket, head poking out just enough to see the street. When Marian fastened the buttons on her puffer coat, Lila glanced at Nathan. He nodded. That nod had become a way of keeping time. Each morning began with one nod, then the door opened, then the sound of shoes on brittle frost, then the whispered, "Let's go." The walk to school was the same route, but it no longer made anyone hunch their shoulders. Lila took the inside. Marianne kept the middle pace beside her, and Nathan walked the outer edge, listening to the crackle of ice underfoot like a sparse piece of music. The school gates stood open. A child called Lila's name. She turned, gripped her backpack straps a little tighter, and smiled, a smile that didn't dodge. Her name was called clearly, warmly, like a button fastening snug in its hole, keeping the collar closed against the wind. Nathan stood a few steps away, not entering, leaving space between himself and the crowded yard as a reminder to himself. Some boundaries are meant to be respected when someone is safe enough to cross them alone. The day moved in small acts. The chicken soup bubbled to a steady simmer without spilling. The tablecloth hung drying on the line, swaying into the wall with a soft thump. The felt strip on the door hinge still caught clean, closing without a sound. Nathan replaced a burnt-out yellow bulb, checked the screws on Lila's bookshelf, and added a pad under its legs so it wouldn't rattle when books were pulled. Together, such things made a wall just high enough to block the wind, yet let light through. At lunch, Marianne opened a paper container, steam curling up like another kind of fog. Lila counted the dry bread pieces, broke each in half, and divided them evenly. Her small hand circled the rim of her bowl again, as if learning the shape of a quiet day. Nathan sat across with a warm cup in his hands, asking a few short words about her reading. Lila nodded, answered briefly, then bent to draw a flower in the margin of her notebook, petals darkening at the edges, fading toward the stem, a new technique she'd just learned. Next to her name, she added a single word, not Silas's surname, just heart standing alone, like a signpost needing no arrow. At night, the small room stood still, as if it knew how to breathe. The desk lamp cast Lila's shadow on the wall, the edges no longer trembling. The teddy bear on the shelf faced the window, watching frost speckle the lawn. Marianne closed her ledger, turned off the kitchen light, leaving one warm lamp in the corner. Nathan sat at the doorway, shoes parallel, dry mud flaking from the soles in two serrated lines. He remembered the white chill of a hospital corridor, the steady breathing of the air vents, the varnished smell of the courtroom, the low hum of wood underfoot, the old house door, the faded porch post where a child once pressed her back to the grain. It all threaded together into one long cord, running from noisy places without sound to a quiet place with human warmth. He didn't think much about victories. In the army, he'd seen maps change color overnight, then change again. Here, there was no map on the wall, only a calendar, a few marked days, a few lines crossed out. The only measure worth trusting was the breath of the person beside you, and the sound of a door closing softly. As night deepened, the kitchen fan droned like a steady heartbeat. Inside, Lila shifted in her sleep, hugging her pillow, not reaching for the doorknob, not startled by the wind. Marianne pulled the blanket to her chest, her hand resting where it once held another, heavier weight. Sometimes Nathan touched the inside seam of his coat, where he'd sewn a small pocket from coarse cloth. Inside was no metal, no citation, just a scrap of paper, in his own faint pencil. A soldier who knows how to listen. Not a title, but a reminder, so that next season he wouldn't forget why he stayed. What he lost wouldn't come back, but some things arrived quietly. A cup of milk that didn't spill, a head that lay still through the night, a laugh that broke free after pronouncing a long word right. Each morning at the school gate, he still stepped back so his shadow wouldn't block the sun on the yard. He saw Lila turn a wave, a short wave. He saw Marianne adjust her coat, her eyes following her daughter until she disappeared. Then they turned toward the kitchen, toward the onion crates, toward inventory lists that read like a looping song. No fireworks, only the smell of toasted bread, of chicken soup, of faint ink on the first paycheck with her name. That was enough. If someone asked what he'd done, he'd probably name only scraps, stitched a teddy bear's ear, patted a hinge, kept a place in a hallway, stepped half aside so a cold glance wouldn't land straight on a child. Nodded in the morning, nodded in the afternoon. Each act, tied together, became a cord fastened to the edge of someone's life, so when the wind pulled, it held. At the end of the season, the first snow fell late, flakes melting as they touched the ground. Lila ran to the porch, holding out her hand, tilting her face to the sky. The teddy bear watched from the shelf, its worn ear no longer a reminder of tearing. Marianne stood behind her, hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Nathan lingered in the doorway, watching through glass fogged with breath. He didn't step in, didn't speak. Close enough, far enough, letting the joy stay exactly where it belonged, within reach of those who had chosen to remain for each other. And in the center of that quiet, an unspoken reminder still carried clear in the chest of someone who knew how to hear. Sometimes, changing a child's whole life only takes one person who doesn't turn away. Some stories don't end with a conclusion, but with a quiet morning, where people still wake up, still tend to small tasks, still save a gentle nod for one another. Nathan, Marianne, and Lila have grown used to that kind of rhythm. No noise, no rush, just enough warmth to carry them into the next day. A soldier who once knew the weight of loss now understands that victory can simply mean keeping a patch of peace for the ones you want to protect. A mother, still thin but standing steadier, knows she no longer has to face the world alone. And a little girl who once pressed herself against the porch post to avoid anyone's gaze now smiles when she hears someone say her name just right. The story stops here, not because it's over, but because the next chapter belongs to them, and to the days we hope will always be warm. If you've ever had a small moment that made you believe you needed to stay, share it. Maybe someone out there is waiting to hear your story.